Well, hey everybody. Hope you're doing well today. Thanks for tuning in. Old story, old joke, great joke. Told it around CCC before. There's a teacher, a volunteer working with kids at a church, younger kids. And imagine it here at CCC in one of our C3 kids ministry environments. It's on a Sunday morning. The kids are all in there and the teacher asks the kids, what's brown, furry, and has a bushy tail and gathers nuts for the winter? And nobody answers. Just silence. So the teacher again asks the group of kids, what's brown, furry, has a bushy tail, gathers nuts for the winter? Still nobody answers. Teacher says, kids, you know this. I know you know this. Think about it. What's brown, furry, has a bushy tail, gathers nuts for the winter? Kids are just staring back at the teacher until one kid finally, almost sheepishly, speaks up and says, well, sure sounds like a squirrel to me, but I'm going to say Jesus. That's the way it can be in churches. The right answer is Jesus, no matter what the question is. But today's message and focus, it is all about Jesus. And this is going to be real simple here because it's just about one thing, this message. Sometimes you can finish listening to a message or a sermon and somebody asks you, hey, what was that message about? And you're like, I don't know. You may have had that happen to you before. I've had that happen to me and I preached the sermon, But today, I think we'll all know what this message is about. It's about Jesus, plain and simple. The whole thing is just about Jesus. We need to turn our eyes to Jesus. We need to have a season where we look at Him and let Him dominate our attention and our lives. We've been down in the mud these last 5 weeks or so, kind of sorting through a quagmire in our culture, and that's been important. But I want to fly us up to the 30,000 foot level and get a perspective that's needed right now. And it's all about Jesus. Today is all about just how big Jesus is. If you have a Bible, there's a section of verses in the first chapter of the book of Colossians. It was written by the Apostle Paul to a little church at Colossae. And when you think about it, this section makes some of the most staggering claims about Jesus. That's what we're going to look at today. Check it out, Colossians 1, beginning in verse 15. This is what Paul wrote. He, meaning Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by Him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by and for Him. He is before all things, and in Him all things hold together. And He's the head of the body, the church. He's the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything He might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all His fullness dwell in Him, and through Him to reconcile to Himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through His blood shed on the cross. Unbelievable words. These verses were actually a poem or a hymn that the early church would sing, and it would try to capture just how big and vast Jesus is in the grand scheme of things. You see, people sometimes know certain facts about Jesus. He was born in a manger, His mother was Mary, lived in Israel, had some disciples, that sort of thing. But they can get a little fuzzy on His scope in the cosmic scheme of things. So today, let's get real clear on the cosmic Jesus. First off, Paul says Jesus is our icon. Now, icon is the literal Greek word that Paul uses that's translated image of God. He's the image of the invisible God. Among other things, the Greeks used that word for a portrait of somebody. They obviously didn't have photograph snapshots in those days. So if you wanted somebody else to know what your grandkids looked like, you had to have portraits painted, and then you could show them. That was an icon. Well, Paul uses the word icon, portrait, for Jesus. He says He's like the portrait of God. He's like a picture of God. Little kid's drawing a picture one day, and mom says, what are you drawing? And the little kid says, I'm drawing a picture of God. She said, well, nobody knows what God looks like. And the kid says, well, I will when I get finished. See, this is one of the biggest questions in human existence. Does God exist? Is there a God? And if there is a God, if somebody's out there, what are they like? The problem, of course, is nobody really knew what God would look like. And Jesus says, well, they will when I get finished. And Paul is adamant about this. Look at verse 19. For in Him, in Jesus, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. How much of the fullness of God? All of it. You don't miss anything when you see Jesus, Paul says. One of the most important teachings about God that Israel gave to the world is God is spirit. He's not an idol. He's not a statue. He's not reduced to a physical presence. And that's hugely important. But it can leave people feeling like this invisible God is kind of distant or hard to know. And Paul says that's not the case now, because Jesus is the visible manifestation, the expression of this invisible God. Jesus himself said at one point, anybody who's seen me, you've seen the Father. And that's a staggering statement to make. What's God like? Well, just look at Jesus. Then you'll know what God's like, because he's the icon. If you've seen the Son, you've seen the Father. He's the image. Paul didn't stop there, of course. He also says Jesus is the creator, and he's our creator. For by him, all things were created. See? Now, a lot of people don't understand this about Jesus, but he's the agent of creation. This is so exciting to Paul. He uses several rhetorical flourishes to celebrate, to convey the meaning of this. And I'll give us a couple of how he does this. See, in Paul's day, they didn't have parentheses. They didn't have grammatical punctuation marks like we do in our day. So if it was a key idea, one of the things they would sometimes do is use a phrase to kind of bracket it, like verbal parentheses. Notice verse 16, Paul does this. He says, for by him all things were created. That's one bracket, okay? Then he says, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. That same phrase, he ends with it because he wants people to get it. You see, all things, everything is created by Jesus. There's a bracket there. Another flourish is a pattern. It's A, B, B, A. Two ideas are stated and then they're repeated, only they're reversed in order. And Paul does that here. Through Jesus, he says, all things in heaven and on earth. That's A and B. That's the start of the pattern. Visible, that's earthly stuff. So we're back to B. And invisible, that's heavenly stuff. Back to A. A, B, B, A. And see, Paul is doing this. He's just getting so poetic here, not to show off his writing skills. He does this for a reason. Because in their world, what they were and what we are too, we're often afraid of powers or rulers, forces that are beyond our little old control. Jesus has the whole world in his hands, Paul says. Some of you might remember that old song. You know, he's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole wide world in his hands. You might remember that. Well, that's what Paul's saying here. That's actually what the prophet Isaiah said too earlier in the Bible, in the 40th chapter of the book of Isaiah. Check this out. This is so amazing. In the 25th verse, he says that God has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand and marked off the heavens with the breadth of his hand. I mean, God says to himself, how big should I make the whole universe? And he looks at his hand and he says, about that big. I'll just eye it up like that. I mean, take a look at your hand for a second, wherever you're watching this. Take a look at it and estimate how big your hand is. I remember when I was growing up, I just wanted to have hands big enough to palm a basketball. And I got to tell you, if a basketball is deflated just a little bit, I can do it. I mean, kind of like, I don't know, Tom Brady or the New England Patriots football kind of deflate gate thing. Just take some of the air out of it and I'm good, you know. Well, God says, how big should I make the universe? About that big. When you think of the size of the universe, you think about solar systems and billions and billions and billions of stars and galaxies and supernovas and black holes. And God says, well, it's about the size of my hand. See, we tend to think of space as being this kind of huge, cold, dark, empty cavern, and God as being really big, but still engulfed by the universe. And Isaiah says God measured the whole thing with the breadth of his hand. See, to picture the whole universe as just kind of fitting in God's hand like that. How big is God? And Paul says, well, that's Jesus. Jesus was an agent of creation. And not just that, I mean, Paul goes on, he says Jesus is the sustainer as well. He's before all things, and in him all things hold together, he says. Now we try to get our arms around this. Our vision of Jesus kind of gets bigger here. It's not just that he made everything and then he let it go, but every moment, from one moment to the next, the only reason that creation keeps on existing is it's being sustained, it's being held together by Jesus. And part of what this means is you are not meant to hold yourself together. It's really interesting. We'll talk about it this way sometimes, you know. Hey, we'll say, I feel like my life is coming apart at the seams. I'm falling apart. Well, you cannot integrate yourself. You were made to depend on Jesus. He is holding it together. And he'd tell us, hey, depend on me, pray to me, look to me, don't give up. You know, an artist named Albrecht Dürer, he painted a pair of hands, became known as praying hands. You may have seen that portrait before. Became pretty famous. But Dürer, this artist, actually was known and got kind of spiritually shaped by Martin Luther. There's a story behind this painting. I mean, nobody knows for sure whether it was true, but it expresses a deep spiritual truth that we're talking about here. Dürer was from a large, poor family. He was the third of 18 children. 18 children. And I guess if you're going to be one of 18 kids, you might as well be the third. But he was a very gifted artist. And a friend of his, might have been his brother, he also loved art. And his friend agreed to work in the mines for a while to support Dürer so he could go to school and learn how to draw. And then eventually they'd trade places, you know. Well, early on, Dürer showed more skill than his teachers. And after several years, he had made enough money for his friend to work as an artist as well. But when he returned home with the news, with the money for that, his friend's hands, they had been too damaged in the mine to be able to hold a paintbrush or skillfully be able to work as an artist. And Dürer had seen his friend's hands clasped in prayer so many times, and he wanted to capture the beauty of those hands in prayer. In fact, it's hard to look at that picture without thinking of hands that have been clasped to pray for you in your life. I mean, how many times in this world has the grace of God been poured out in ways we'll never understand because somebody all by themselves is doing this? They're praying. Do you ever do this? Do you know Jesus as the sustainer of your life and your world? See, Paul here uses the perfect tense in the first chapter of Colossians, which indicates continuous action in the Greek. In Jesus, all things are continually being held together, is what he's saying. In other words, he didn't just create us and leave us on our own. He is sustaining us right now. He is the one right now that causes the sun to keep shining. He is the one right now that causes gravity to allow us to be in our places, you know. If you ever heard somebody say, I don't think I can hold it all together. We don't have to, because that's his job. Jesus is doing that. At the beginning of Hebrews, the first chapter, third verse says, the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. I mean, just a word from Jesus and all things hold together. Every moment that you and I live, it's the result of the sustaining grace of Jesus. Well, Paul goes on. He says, essentially, Jesus is our authority too. He says he's the head of the body, the church. And the Bible here, Paul here, he's kind of making a turn at this point. You'll notice up until now, it's been about creation, which is amazing. You know, he made it, sustains it. But now there's this new creation, which is the church. That's what Jesus is up to now. The church was Jesus' idea. And so his followers, they begin to meet together. This collection of people called a church. They begin to meet together. And for several centuries, they had no buildings to meet in at all. And they'd meet anywhere. They'd meet in the tombs. They'd meet in the catacombs in Rome. And his movement, against all odds, it begins to spread over time. And eventually, great cathedrals will be built to lift up people's vision to Jesus. Now, Jesus' followers didn't just meet in cathedrals, though. They'd meet in huts in Africa. They'd meet in underground churches in China. They'd meet in storefronts. I mean, we meet here at 8009 Corporate Drive, inside and outside on the back parking lot under a tent. You know, when we first launched CCC, I wanted to meet in the movie theater over on the Avenue. That was my number one target because you didn't have to tell people where the movie theater in White Marsh was. And I like movies. Now we meet online. But listen, did you ever wonder why after 2,000 years, the church still meets, still exists? And I'll give you a clue. It's not because we are so well organized. I meet people sometimes, you may have heard people say this. They say, you know, I like Jesus, but I don't like organized religion. I've been around some churches that feel like disorganized religion. Maybe you should try one of those out, you know. See, the church has not lasted 2,000 years because it has a really cool organizational chart. I mean, the most important thing about a church is not the building. And the most important thing about a church is not the people. The most important thing about the church is the glorious person to whom it belongs, the church's head. And the head of this church is not me, and it's not you, it's It's not the elders, not the leaders, it's not the staff, it's not the ministry team leaders. The head of the church is Jesus. And there's nothing like a church, never has been. Jesus is our head, and part of what that means is we don't get to make up who this Jesus is and what he's about. We meet him in the Bible. The authority of Jesus also includes the authority of the Bible, in which we uniquely come to know him. And just know, as we face the future, whatever changes go on in our world, whatever happens in our big world and our little worlds, know that this doesn't change. Jesus Christ is the head of our church. And so we obey him. That was true yesterday. It's true today. It'll be true forever and ever until one day he'll come back one day to restore this broken, dark, sorry, messed up world. And the reason he holds that place is because he conquered death. Jesus is our death defeater, Paul says. Now you think about death. I mean, death, it's just the worst. I remember my dad telling me when he was a younger man, he went and actually saw Louis Armstrong perform in Knoxville, Tennessee. And he had an opportunity after the concert to go backstage, and there was a group of them there that got to be backstage in this room with Louis Armstrong for a while. And Armstrong, he had a friend who had died recently, and somebody in that group, they asked Armstrong, they said, hey, what was wrong with him? But Armstrong didn't hear him correctly, and Armstrong thought he said, what is wrong with him? And Armstrong replied, when you're dead, everything's wrong with you. You see, death is the worst. But Paul says there's a new reality now, a new opportunity because of Jesus. Paul says, Jesus is the beginning and firstborn from the dead, so that in everything, including death, he might have supremacy. Some of you may have heard of the Heidelberg Catechism. Starts with a question, what is your only comfort? Then it answers that question, that I am not my own, but belong body and soul in life and in death to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ. I mean, those are incredible words. I am not my own. It's very countercultural. I mean, whose life is it anyway? Well, it's not mine. But I belong body and soul, life and death to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ. I mean, that's a place to stand. That's a foundation for life. So here's the question. Is he your only hope in life and in death? Because you have a life, you're gonna have a death. You have to have a hope. Is it him? Well, Paul goes on, he declares that Jesus is our reconciler. Paul says, for God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things. See, Jesus is our world's one hope for reconciliation and peace. And man, how we need peace. There's a part of England called Cotswold, and there used to be something called the Cotswold Olympics. In the 1600s, 1700s, they had all these Olympian activities, running, wrestling, and the like. But there were some pretty odd games they competed in as well. And one of them, and I'm not making this up, one of them was called shin kicking. They actually had a contest called shin kicking. I'm not kidding here. Two people would grab each other by the collar and kick each other in the shins until somebody falls down or gives up. Now that's the human race. We are shin kickers. That's what we do. I mean, don't believe me? Look on Facebook. It's the modern version of the Cotswold Olympics and shin kicking. So Paul says that in this pathetic, you hurt me, I'll hurt you back, you kicked me, I'll kick you back world, someone has come and torn down the dividing wall of human hostility and given us an option, a path, a way. I mean, Jew, Greek, slave, free, male, female, rich, poor, black, white. Paul says he himself is our peace. Jesus, the greatest peacemaker the world has ever known. Now, what happens is all this that Paul's talking about here, it gets really, really personal for you and me. I mean, thinking about the cosmic Jesus, what's incredible is he's so big and yet he's so personal. He comes to each human being. And the question really is personal. It's not just, do you know about him? And it's not just, do you find him inspirational in some way? It's, do you know him? Really know him? Do you walk with him in this life each day, each moment of each day even? That's the real question. Well, you can. You can know him. He can be your forgiver and your friend and your leader and your Lord. I mean, the Lord of the universe can be the Lord of your life. And then He'll send His Spirit to inspire you for every day of this life and prepare you for the life everlasting, because nothing is too much for Him. I want you to know nothing is too much for Him because of who He is. And who is He? Who is Jesus? Well, He's the maker of the universe. He's the sustainer of existence. He's the ruler over every power, no matter how big it looks to us now. He's the image of God, the icon. He's the fullness of God and the wisdom of God and the presence of God. He's the death defeater and the sin conqueror and the guilt obliterator. He's the final sacrifice and the cross bearer and the tomb breaker. He's the peacemaker. He's now head over this body, His church. He's the reconciler of all things. And He is the maker, redeemer, savior, forgiver, Lord, friend, guide, shepherd, and hope for all eternity. And His name is Jesus. And so we celebrate Him today. In fact, we're going to celebrate Him right now. Something we do each time we gather together through communion. We remember how this big cosmic God sacrificed for us so that we could be connected to Him. So wherever you're watching this, get some bread and juice. Use those things to remind yourself Jesus' body that was given for you and His blood that was spilled for you. And you thank God that He paved the way. Let's celebrate communion now.